Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in the history of Appalachia. In the shadowy highlands of East Tennessee in 1921, the quiet of the woods conceals mysteries that time has never been able to uncover. This narrative will make you reevaluate all you know about justice and truth, so let us know where you are watching. At the age of 28, Martha Whitlock's name started to reverberate throughout Cockey County's foggy valleys. She was a well-known local woman who worked as a seamstress in that mountainous region's largest town, Newport. In those days, life in East Tennessee followed the steady rhythm of the seasons. Everyone knew one another, and even the tiniest happenings were covered by the local newspapers. There has always been a distinct character to the Appalachian Mountains. Deep valleys carved by cold streams, mist-covered peaks, and winding paths between old oaks. It was a stunning location, but it was also remote. Wagons could not fit on the narrow dirt roads, and traveling from it could take days to go from one town to another. A settlement of perhaps 2,000 people, Newport was tucked away among these elevations, and survived mostly on agriculture, lumber, and small-scale trade. Martha resided in a little log home close to the Parrottsville Road on the outskirts of Newport. She frequently spent her warm afternoons sitting on the tiny porch of this basic building, which had 2 front windows. Her neighbors characterized her as friendly but reserved. She had never been married, which was already a topic of private discussion in a culture in which unmarried women over 25 were somewhat curious. Martha had an appointment to attend a meeting at the local Methodist church in late March of that year, which was typical for that extremely pious group. Thursday was the day. The temperature had fallen considerably the night before, and the sky was heavy with low clouds that threatened rain. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Martha had told Mrs. Elena Hayes, a neighbor, that she would walk to church, the last person to witness her departing the home. She recalls Martha carrying a tiny cloth purse and dressed in a dark skirt and gray wool coat. The weather and the message the pastor had prepared for that evening were discussed briefly. Martha appeared typical, maybe a touch worn out, but nothing out of the ordinary. Elena went back to the house while she proceeded along the gravel path toward the church. That evening, Martha never showed up to the Methodist church. For nearly an hour, the pastor waited, wondering why she was a frequent visitor. Following the conclusion of the conference and when Martha failed to appear, some people began conversing, but nobody thought anything significant had occurred. Ultimately, she might have opted not to travel, felt ill, or changed her mind. Alarm bells didn't start ringing until the next day, when Martha failed to show up for work at the modest sewing business where she served her clientele. Around lunchtime, Judith Brennan, the owner of the store, visited Martha at her home. She repeatedly pounded on the door, but got no response. The windows were closed, the home quiet. When Judith got back to town, she called Thomas Callahan, the local sheriff, to report Martha missing. Middle-aged and robust, Sheriff Callahan had a thick mustache and a practical outlook. He recognized Martha by sight and realized she was a regular woman, with 2 deputies in tow. That following afternoon, he visited her home. The door was not locked. Everything appeared to be in order inside. The dishes were cleaned, the bed was made, and some clothes were folded on a chair. There was no indication of a struggle, escape, or any disruption of any kind. However, there was an oddity. They discovered a half-empty teacup with residue lingering at the bottom on the kitchen table. There was a slice of bread next to it that seemed to have been chewed only once, as though Martha had been interrupted during a straightforward supper and had never been back. These information were recorded by the sheriff in a battered notebook, but nobody understood their true significance at the time. The disappearance was widely reported. Newport was too small to maintain secrecy. Within 48 hours, almost everyone in the community was aware of. that Martha Whitlock had disappeared completely. There were search parties. The local blacksmith, farmers, and merchants all offered their time to search the area's paths, thick forests, and the banks of the French Broad River. They looked for 3 days in a row, from dawn to dusk, but they couldn't find anything. Small blurbs started to appear in local publications. The city's weekly, the Newport Plain Talk, published a covert story about the disappearance in its April 2nd issue, requesting anyone with details to come forward. Martha gave a straightforward description. A Caucasian, average-height woman with light eyes and dark brown hair was last seen sporting a dark skirt and gray coat. Sheriff Callahan began a more official investigation in the interim. Elelena Hayes reiterated her story of the informal parting on Thursday afternoon when he interviewed her. He talked to Martha's co-workers, business owners who knew her, and the Methodist church pastor. The same thing was said by all of them. Martha was a discreet, diligent individual with no known adversaries. Nobody was aware of any disputes, obligations, or private issues that may account for a disappearance. However, as is typically the case in tiny communities, there were whispers. There were rumors that Martha was communicating with a man from Knoxville, but nobody was certain who he was. Some muttered that a few weeks prior, she had been spotted conversing with a traveling salesman who had stopped by the neighborhood. Hazy, unverified tales originating from the general unease with the mysterious. The sheriff also looked into the idea that Martha had just fled in search of a better life somewhere else. The theory made sense. Particularly in conservative societies, single women occasionally felt the pressure of social expectations and chose to vanish on their own volition. However, this theory wasn't very reliable. All of Martha's funds were hidden in a cookie jar in a closet. It was $140, which was a significant amount at the time. Nobody intends to flee with their money. Behind. The case cooled during the next few weeks. The search was put on hold. Although Martha Whitlock's name continued to be referenced in whispered discussions, always followed by an awkward silence, life in Newport resumed its regular rhythm. Sheriff Callahan did his best to keep the case open, but he was powerless in the absence of fresh clues. Then an unforeseen event occurred. William Dutch, a hunter, was trekking a secluded mountain track approximately 5 miles north of Newport in late April. He was trailing. When he saw something out of the ordinary among the woods, he saw deer footprints. As he got closer, he discovered a cloth bag half hidden behind fallen branches and wet leaves. The bag belonged to Martha Whitlock. William Dutch brought the bag right away to the Newport Sheriff's Office. He set the item on the scuffed wooden table, his hands shaking. Sheriff Callahan paid close attention to every detail. The bag was still identifiable despite being filthy and soiled from dampness and dirt. They discovered a handkerchief with a small broken mirror, a few loose pennies, and Martha's initials sewn on it. Nothing more. The finding gave the probe a fresh lease on life. The location where the bag had been located was the focus of a new search mission that the sheriff organized. With its thick foliage and several steep gorges, that area was especially hostile. Experienced hunters and a few families who lived in remote huts at higher elevations were the main users of the paths there. For 5 days, teams of every square meter of that forest was cleaned by volunteers. In order to find any clue or proof that could explain what had happened to Martha, they moved in formation while keeping their eyes focused on the leaf-covered ground. It wasn't helped by the weather. The ground became slick with mud from frequent rain, and visibility was limited to a few meters due to mountain fog. About 2 kilometers from the main trail, on the 3rd day of the search, one of the volunteers discovered pieces of gray fabric adhered to a thorn bush. The content was consistent with the description of Martha's coat from the night she vanished. The sheriff extended the search area and staked out the location with wooden objects. The level of tension was increasing. No one knew exactly what it was, but everyone sensed they were getting closer. Then came the revelation that would alter everything. Two sheriff's deputies discovered an area tucked away behind old boulders on the morning of May 7th, in a location so far away that not even the most skilled hunters would venture there. In that location, partially hidden by branches and Martha Whitlock, was the vegetation that someone had obviously planned to hide. Sheriff Callahan was called right away. Together with the local doctor, Dr. Harrison Mills, who also acted as coroner in the few instances that called for it, he ascended into the clearing. The scene was unsettling because of the complete silence that surrounded it, not because of the obvious brutality. With her hands folded across her chest in a seemingly intentional pose, Martha rested on her back. Her gray coat was ripped in. Her skirt was smeared with dirt in multiple places. There, in the filtered light of the trees, Dr. Mills conducted a preliminary examination. He took thorough notes in a notebook he carried in his jacket pocket while working in silence for about an hour. It was challenging to determine the precise moment of death because the body displayed evidence of extended exposure to the weather, although there were no visible signs of severe violence. Mills saw markings on the neck that would indicate strangulation. The word got out. Like a wildfire in the arid mountains, it swept over Newport. The following day, the headline took up half of the top page of the local newspaper's special edition. The streets were busy. On street corners, people gathered in groups and talked about what might have happened. The community was overcome with fear. Anyone could experience something similar to what happened to Martha Whitlock. At Municipal Hall, Sheriff Callahan established a modest command post in a rear room. Area maps were shown on the walls with colorful pins, pointing to pertinent landmarks: Martha's residence, the Methodist church, the place where the purse was recovered, the final clearing. In an attempt to figure out how Martha got off the main road and into this isolated area, he started mapping out potential paths. The interview started up again, but with a new sense of urgency. Elela Nana Hayes was questioned by the sheriff once more about every aspect of that March afternoon. Eleanor told the same story again, but this time she added something that didn't seem significant at the time. She recalled that same week seeing a stranger in the neighborhood. Someone tall, with a big bag and a dark cap, according to her description. Elela Nana could not recall the precise location where he had asked for instructions. Similar sightings were reported by other locals. A few days prior to the disappearance, Henry Morrison, a farmer, reported seeing an unknown person camped close to the French Broad River. Joseph Crane, the town's blacksmith, recalls fixing a belt buckle for a tourist who fit the same description. But no. One was aware of the man's name, origin, and destination. After bringing the body to his Newport clinic, Dr. Mills finished his most thorough examination. The conclusions of his report, which was written in neat cursive, raised more questions than answers. Although asphyxiation possibly by strangulation was the most likely cause of death, it was hard to be absolutely positive due to the state of the body. Mills was intrigued that there were no further defensive wounds. Martha had unbroken fingernails, and there were no scratches, suggesting a protracted battle. And he saw something strange. When Martha was discovered, she was barefoot, but there were just minor scars on her feet, nothing appropriate for a lengthy hike across unpaved ground. No one ever found her shoes. A troubling theory was sparked by this discovery. Maybe Martha hadn't gone to that clearing by herself. Maybe she hadn't been able to resist, had been taken away, or was already asleep. Sheriff Callahan made the decision to review the entry and departure data for the area. During the period, there was no actual authority over who came into and went out of Newport, but he had conversations with stagecoach drivers who frequently passed through the area, the manager of the closest train station in Morristown, and the owners of the town's 2 boarding houses. Although a number of people passed through the area every week, no one had any records of foreigners who were especially suspicious. The inquiry also looked at Martha's private life. Permission was granted for the sheriff to review her letters, which were kept in a wooden box in her house. He discovered correspondence regarding sewing orders, payment receipts, and correspondence with a Chattanooga-based cousin. Nothing that suggested hostilities or danger. However, there were 3 messages from a sender based in Knoxville who signed only as J. Although the letters were friendly and discussed social events and the weather, they were written with a familiarity that suggested a strong friendship. J was who? When the sheriff attempted to use postmarks to determine the letter's origin, he found. Since they were sent from various Knoxville agencies, the sender could not be identified. He spent 3 days traveling to that city, which is the biggest in East Tennessee, giving Martha a physical description and asking about potential contacts. The search was unsuccessful. Finding someone based on 3 ambiguous letters was like trying to find a needle in a haystack in Knoxville, which had a population of over 70,000. In the meantime, rumors started to spread throughout Newport. There were others who thought Martha had set up a covert rendezvous with this enigmatic J, and that things had gone horribly wrong. Others said that since she was in the wrong location at the wrong time, she had been the victim of a random crime. Some even muttered about terrible stories passed down through years of sacrifices and mysterious agreements, as well as ancient mountain ceremonies. Although the sheriff wrote them off as superstition, he was unable to deny how much they represented a shared fear. During the investigation, an interesting fact surfaced. Martha had taken $50 out of her 2 weeks before to her disappearance, savings. The Clear distinctly recalled that she had gone to the Newport bank and taken out the money in cash because it was a sizable amount. The money was never recovered, and Martha failed to provide an explanation for the withdrawal. Her purse did not contain it. She didn't live there. She didn't have it. Where was that money now? The sheriff started thinking about blackmailing people. Maybe someone was pressuring Martha to pay for a secret she wanted to keep concealed. It was a sinister but believable theory. He questioned everyone he knew about Martha, inquiring about any recent behavioral shifts or indications of anxiety or terror. It was always the same response. Martha appeared to be normal, maybe a little more reserved in the last few weeks, but not particularly so. Sheriff Callahan's annoyance increased proportionately as May went on. It seemed like every lead ended in a dead end. Each witness reiterated unhelpful facts. He was under increasing strain. Residents of Newport demanded explanations, wanted to know whether their own families were in danger or whether there was a killer on the loose. The streets were empty after nightfall, and the women of the town started to leave their houses only in groups. An odd source provided an unexpected twist. Ruth Pendleton, a woman, came to the sheriff on May 23rd with a startling tale. Ruth rarely visited Newport. She resided in a remote home in the Highlands approximately 3 miles away. She was a widow who raised poultry and farmed a little plot of land to make ends meet. On the evening of March 31st, Ruth heard an odd noise coming from the woods as she was making her way back after seeing a neighbor. The sound, according to her, was a muffled scream that was followed by a thick quiet. Ruth halted on the path, her heart pounding, attempting to determine the precise source of the sound. There wasn't much light coming through the thick woods that night because the moon was only starting to rise. After waiting for a few minutes, she didn't hear anything else. Ruth fled back to her cabin in terror, locking every door. She thought about the following day. she traveled to Newport to report the occurrence, but she persuaded herself that it was only a woodland animal. The pieces didn't start to fit together in Ruth's thoughts until she heard about Martha Whitlock while she was in town a few weeks later. The date coincided with the night she vanished. Between the main road and the clearing where Martha had been discovered was where she had heard the scream. Ruth regretted not speaking up earlier, but the sheriff comforted her. He made a mark on. The map adds another piece to the dark jigsaw by showing the approximate location of Ruth's hearing. The sheriff used this new information to formulate a theory regarding the events that transpired. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Martha left her house and headed toward the church. Someone stopped her somewhere along the route. Maybe it was someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to veer off course. Alternatively, she might have been coerced or blackmailed in a fashion that left no witnesses. The sheriff went back to the road between the Methodist church and Martha's house, giving each yard a fresh look. It was around 2 kilometers long, mostly through sparsely populated areas, followed by a more isolated section encircled by forests. He searched for locations where Martha might have been forcibly removed from the road without anyone noticing. 3 options were available: a hunter's side track, a fork that led to an old deserted sawmill and a narrow passage that cut through an empty property. Callahan looked into each of these options. With its broken windows allowing rain and wind to enter, the abandoned sawmill was reduced to a skeleton of decaying wood. Animal feces and piled leaves littered the ground. No indications of recent human habitation were found. The passage through the vacant property revealed something intriguing, but the hunter's trail likewise revealed nothing noteworthy. The farm was owned by Arnold Hutchkins, who abandoned it after relocating to Kentucky 2 years prior. A little storage structure was partially destroyed, the fence was down in numerous places, and the grass was overrun. The sheriff discovered an old blanket rolled up in a corner, empty cans, and new fire marks inside the storage structure. It had served as a makeshift shelter for someone. It was an important discovery. The sheriff gave his men instructions to look into every local business and find out who had bought supplies in the final weeks of March. The owner of the general store is an old man named Patrick. O'Brien recalled a client he didn't know. The man had bought some candles, bread, cheese, and canned beans. He made his cash payment and merely mentioned that he was in the neighborhood. The description fit the enigmatic figure who had been discussed by others. He was tall, wore a dark hat, and had an ordinary appearance that didn't draw much notice. The sheriff started creating a profile. It's possible that this man had come to Newport just a few days before to Martha going missing. He had temporarily set up shop in the deserted warehouse where he could covertly watch traffic on the road. However, how did he relate to Martha? Was he just an opportunistic criminal who picked a victim at random, or was he the enigmatic J in the letters? The sheriff made the decision to run an advertisement in nearby towns' newspapers in an attempt to address these queries. It was a straightforward text. A man between the ages of 30 and 40 who was about 6 feet tall and might have been traveling alone through East. Late March in Tennessee. The Newport Sheriff's Office should get any information. The Morristown Gazette, the Knoxville Journal, and 3 other local newspapers carried the advertisement. After 1 week, responses started to come in. The majority were unrelated, with witnesses claiming sightings that didn't correspond with the descriptions or dates. However, Callahan was particularly interested in one letter. About 30 miles south of Newport, in Seaviewville, it originated from a boarding house. Margaret Foster, the proprietor, stated that a visitor who fit that description had spent 3 nights at her place in early March. At the earliest chance, the sheriff went to Sevier-Ville. Margaret Foster was a middle-aged, careful woman who meticulously documented every visitor. A man called James Thornton had stayed from March 6th to the 9th, and his entry was in the guest book she showed Callahan. He had left without leaving a forwarding address, paid in cash, and kept to himself. Could James Thornton's name be represented by the letter J? It was an intriguing prospect. Despite the fact that the room had been used by other visitors for more than 2 months, the sheriff asked permission to check the room where the man had stayed. He nevertheless conducted a thorough search, looking in every drawer and every nook. Until he looked inside the small gap between the bed and the wall, he discovered nothing. A small piece of paper with writing on it was laying there, neglected. It was a raggedly torn piece of a letter. The words were, the sheriff's heart raced despite the small number. Meet at the location we mentioned on Thursday after dark. Bring what we decided. Martha, please don't let me down. The sheriff's hands were shaking as he grasped the document. Although the remainder of the letter was absent, it was hard to determine who wrote those lines or what specific arrangement Martha was expected to deliver. This was tangible proof that Martha had purposefully set up a meeting with someone. She had taken out something else with the $50. Returning to Newport, Callahan presented the piece to a few individuals who knew Martha's handwriting. They all agreed that her handwriting wasn't it. Martha was not just going to church that Thursday. Rather, she had a covert meeting scheduled because someone had written that message to her rather than the other way around. However, did she attend the meeting or was she stopped before arriving? The wording of the message caught the sheriff's attention as well. There was a subliminal threat in the phrase, "Don't let me down," a psychological strain. Martha was compelled to cooperate, even though she didn't want to because whoever wrote it had some sort of power over her. Was it debt, blackmail, or something darker? Unexpectedly, another piece of information surfaced as I worked to solve these mysteries. An interesting story was told to the sheriff by a lumber merchant who traded between several towns in East Tennessee. He had read about the case in the newspapers and went by Douglas Freeman. According to Douglas, he met Martha Whitlock. A trip to Knoxville several months prior. Martha had mentioned being worried about a delicate family situation during their brief conversation at a social event. With his hat on his knees, Douglas Freeman sat in the battered chair across from the sheriff's desk. As he remembered that exchange with Martha, he appeared to be truly distressed. He claimed that in late January of that year, they had met at a social event hosted by a Knoxville Merchants Association. Martha had a client with her who had brought her to increase her network of business contacts. She spoke with Douglas for about 20 minutes during a break. Martha had cautiously and ambiguously indicated that she had a complex family land ownership situation. Douglas understood the essence of her worry, even though she didn't go into further detail. A plot of land that had belonged to Martha's parents, who had passed away years earlier, was reportedly the subject of a dispute. Someone was asserting ownership rights and contesting the validity of the ownership. Martha appeared nervous, stating that she was attempting to settle the issue out of court because she lacked the funds for a drawn-out legal procedure. This discovery paved the way for further research. Sheriff Callahan was aware that violent conflict frequently resulted from land disputes in the Tennessee mountains. Poorly drawn boundaries, contested inheritances, and dubious documents had caused entire families to clash. Martha might have unknowingly made dangerous enemies if she had been involved in something similar. Callahan left. To the Corky County Clerk's office, a brick structure in Newport's downtown that held dusty records spanning decades. He combed through property records for 2 full days, looking for any reference to the Whitlock name. At last, he discovered what he was searching for. An 1897 deed documenting Martha Whitlock's parents, Samuel and Elizabeth Whitlock, having purchased about 20 acres of land. Northeast of Newport, the property was tucked away in the mountains. The sheriff's attention was drawn to a marginal notation created only 2 years prior, in 1919. A formal dispute over the property had been filed by someone who claimed that a significant amount of the land actually belonged to an adjacent property, and that the original boundaries were wrong. Elias Thornton, a resident of Parrotsville, Thornton, who shared the same last name as the individual who had been at the boarding house in Sevierville, was the disputing party. Was that just a coincidence? That kind of coincidence didn't sit well with the sheriff. He looked, examined the documents more thoroughly, and found that Elias Thornton's land did, in fact, abut the Whitlock property. The land at the center of the conflict showed indications of mineral reserves that could be rich if properly explored. The following morning, Callahan and one of his assistants went to Parrotsville. Little more than a collection of homes along a main road, the town was even smaller than Newport. A few miles from the town was Elias Thornton's property, a small farm with fields under cultivation and a pristine wooden home. A woman in her 50s welcomed them and identified herself as Elias's wife, Sarah Thornton. They graciously declined Sarah's offer of coffee when she invited them inside. In order to justify his visit, the sheriff brought up the Martha Whitlock inquiry. Immediately, a shadow passed across Sarah's face, changing her expression. She claimed that although she was aware of the land issue and knew Martha by sight, her husband had withdrawn his challenge months earlier. Long time ago. She claimed that Elias had chosen to dismiss the case after realizing the legal bills weren't worth it. Sarah paused before responding to Callahan's request to talk with Elias. Her spouse wasn't at home. He had not yet returned from his 2-month trip to Virginia in search of coal mine employment. She only knew that they maintained in contact through occasional letters, but she had no idea when he would return. The most recent one she had received was sent in mid-April, from Norton, a town close to the Virginia-Kentucky line. The sheriff inquired as to whether Elias had a sibling or other family member named James. Sarah scowled contemplatively. James Thornton was Elias's younger brother, but the two had been at odds for a long time. James was a nomad who would sometimes show up to borrow money before vanishing once more. Sarah was unsure of his whereabouts because she hadn't seen him in at least a year. When asked how James looked, she said he was a tall, slender man with an inclination to wear hats with a wide brim. The mystery man suited the description. Callahan demanded to see the letters Elias had sent from Virginia before departing. The sheriff was able to read the contents of the 3 envelopes that Sarah delivered. The letters were straightforward and discussed the difficult working conditions, homesickness, and hard labor in the mines. The sheriff saw the postmarks, but nothing there indicated any connection to Martha's disappearance. On February 28th, the first letter was sent, and on February 28th, the second. March 20th and April 15th, respectively. The second and third letters, which covered the precise time frame of Martha's disappearance, were significantly separated. The sheriff organized his findings back in Newport. Now it was evident how the Thorntons and Martha Whitlock were related. Even though the land issue had not resulted in legal action, it had caused hostility. Elias's errant brother, James Thornton, had reportedly been in the vicinity at the precise moment of the disappearance. He might have sent Martha the signed J letters, presumably in an attempt to demand money from her in return for resolving the ownership dispute. However, things didn't add up. Why would James kill Martha if all he wanted was money? The ownership question remained unresolved after her death. The land would still be there. The sheriff made the decision to re-examine the Whitlock property because he was unsure if it would eventually pass to other heirs or be claimed by the county. Accompanied. One June afternoon, Callahan rode to the farm accompanied by 2 assistants. Since Martha's parents passed away, the location had been deserted for many years. Only a leaking roof and unstable walls remained of the family's previous house after it partially collapsed. Where garden beds had once been, young trees had grown, and the area had become overrun with vegetation. The three men meticulously investigated the area. They checked the disputed boundary with the Thorntons' land by strolling along the property line. It was a coarse piece of terrain that follows a rocky outcrop's contours. At first glance, the rocky earth and deep forest didn't seem especially valuable. However, the assistant, Robert Hayes, saw something strange close to the ridge's highest point. The earth had marks on it. Earth has recently experienced what appeared to be intentional upheavals. Not long ago, someone had excavated there. The rectangular pattern created by the marks suggested that something had been buried and subsequently taken out. The sheriff gave them instructions to delve further and look for anything that might be concealed. They worked in the sweltering June heat for almost an hour before discovering something at the bottom of the dig. It was a box of rusty metal, the type used to hold vital papers. Robert was able to use an iron bar to force open the sealed lid. Old papers were inside, shielded by waxed cloth. The sheriff took a close look at each. They included records pertaining to the Whitlock estate, such as the original purchase agreement, tax returns, and correspondence between Samuel Whitlock and the previous landowner. At the bottom of the box, however, was the most important document. 2 years prior to Samuel Whitlock's official acquisition of the land, in 1895, a mineral rights deal was signed. According to the terms of the contract, the owner of that particular plot of land would have the sole right to any minerals discovered within a 50-acre radius, including portions of the land that would eventually become the Thornton property. The document was signed by a representative of a mining corporation in North Carolina. At last, the sheriff recognized those mineral rights were precious, possibly extremely valuable. In the 1920s, that contract might have been worth thousands of dollars due to the rising need for coal and other minerals. Someone would have enough justification for significant crimes if they were aware of the document's existence and desired to take it. The investigation was drastically changed when the metal box was found. Under the faint glow of a kerosene lamp, Sheriff Callahan spent the whole night in his office going through the documents and making thorough notes on every sheet of paper. He needed to know the precise meaning of these mineral rights and who else might be aware of them. The following morning, the sheriff went in search of Herbert Dalton, a local lawyer who maintained a small office on Newport's Main Street. Dalton had spent years working on land conflicts in the Highlands, so he had familiarity with mining and property issues. The lawyer's eyes widened when Callahan showed him the 1895 contract. Dalton clarified that this kind of the contract was quite valuable. Mining corporations in the early 20th century sometimes sold exploration rights for small sums, having no idea how much the properties would be valued decades later. That specific document may ensure its holder a sizable fortune, given the expansion of the coal industry and the discovery of important mineral reserves in the eastern Tennessee highlands. According to Dalton, the rights outlined therein might be worth anything from $5 to $10,000, or more if there. Buyers who are interested. Did Martha know about this document? The sheriff then inquired, posing the important question. Dalton wasn't sure, but he guessed maybe not. Martha probably would have exploited the mineral rights to get out of the modest poverty she lived in if she had realized the true value of that box hidden on her parents' land. She lived in a modest home and continued to work as a seamstress, indicating that she was unaware of the potential wealth that was literally buried beneath her land. However, someone was aware that someone had learned about that contract and made the decision to seize it at any cost. Elias, the oldest of the Thornton brothers, had started the legal challenge to the property, so the sheriff focused on them. Did he know about the mineral rights and James, the misbehaving brother, or was it just greed for more land? What role did he play in all of this? Callahan made the decision to learn more about James Thornton's background. He telegrammed the sheriffs in nearby counties, inquiring as to whether anyone knew of an individual with such name. Although it took many days for the responses to come in, they presented an unsettling image. James Thornton has a history of theft, forgery, fraud, and small-time offenses. 3 years prior, he had been imprisoned for 6 months in Kentucky for attempting to sell land that was not his. Something was starting to take shape. James was a con artist who lived on tricking people, constantly searching for the next simple swindle. Had he discovered? He would undoubtedly attempt to take possession of the Whitlock property's mining rights. How, though, had he known? And why, on that fateful Thursday, had Martha consented to see him? The sheriff went back to the letters he had discovered in Martha's home, the ones that were simply signed J, and he read each one again from a different angle. The texts were purposefully vague, discussing unresolved problems and unfinished business. If we work together, we both gain. Callahan saw now that James was deceiving Martha, tricking her into thinking he possessed crucial records or information about her parents' fortune. In exchange for some sort of payment or settlement, he had probably pledged to assist her in resolving the conflict with Elias. Now it made clear why Martha had taken out $50. She thought she was purchasing possibly a document he claimed to have when she brought that money to her meeting with James. James, however, desired far more than $50. Martha most likely didn't want the mineral rights contract, but he did. Even be aware of its existence or location. The sheriff created a timeline of what happened. Perhaps after hearing about the Whitlock estate from his brother, James had come to the area in early March. Using the abandoned warehouse as a base, he had first remained in Sevierville before relocating closer to Newport. He had written to Martha over the course of these weeks, either earning her trust or gradually intimidating her. The meeting was set for the evening of March 31st. Martha was gone. The house believing she was heading to church, but in fact she intended to meet James first, most likely at the deserted warehouse or anywhere on the road. In an attempt to settle the matter swiftly and still attend the church ceremony, she carried the $50. James, however, had no desire for money. He wanted to know where the mineral rights contract was. The problem worsened when Martha refused or was unable to offer this information. It was not entirely apparent what transpired at the encounter, but the sheriff could speculate. When James learned Martha didn't have what he desired, he became enraged. He might have threatened her by requesting that she bring him to her parents' house so he could search it. They ultimately arrived at the deserted lot after hiking along the mountain trails. James must have compelled Martha to disclose the location of potentially crucial documents there. However, this idea had a flaw. Why kill Martha after James had discovered the metal box with the mineral rights? He would has received what he desired. Unless Martha had seen something, saw his face clearly, and he had to keep her quiet so she wouldn't be recognized. Or maybe the death was unexpected, the consequence of a heated argument or a panic attack. The sheriff felt he had to find James Thornton when Martha threatened to scream or flee. Every town in eastern Tennessee and the surrounding states received arrest warrants and thorough descriptions from him. He advertised in newspapers that there would be a reward for information that led to the capture of the suspect. He sent telegraphs to officials in Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky. Now, James was the most sought-after individual in the area. There was no noteworthy news for weeks. With the arrival of summer and its unbearable heat, investigative work became much more taxing. Although Martha Whitlock's case was still being discussed in Newport, its importance was starting to wane. Even when horrible questions are left unanswered, life continues on as usual. Next, on. A telegram from Asheville, North Carolina, came on July 18th. A man who fit James Thornton's description was detained while attempting to sell a dubious paper to a land speculator. He was being detained by local officials as they verified his identity. Sheriff Callahan quickly set out, taking the train to a small town tucked away in the Appalachians through the mountains. The sheriff was led to a cell in the rear of the Asheville police station when he arrived. Construction. A tall, skinny man with dirty travel clothes and a stubble sat on a short cot. He looked at Callahan with a mix of resignation and defiance in his dark, calculating eyes. He was asked his name by the sheriff. Callahan experienced a thrill of grim satisfaction as the man paused for a time before responding hoarsely, "James Thornton." He now had his top suspect in front of him after months of stress and seeking, but apprehending James was just the first step. He had to persuade him to confess now, or collect sufficient evidence to ensure a conviction, at the very least. He asked to speak with the prisoner in private. The questioning went on for hours. At first, James denied everything, saying he had never visited Newport, that he didn't know anyone named Martha Whitlock, and that the document he was trying to sell was something he had discovered abandoned on a road. However, his statements were weak and full of contradictions. Callahan presented him with the boarding house record, witnesses who had seen him in Newport, and other proof. The handwriting on the letters in Sevierville matched samples that James had created when signing documents in Asheville. James's facade gradually started to crumble under the sheriff's relentless prodding. Although it was simply passing through, he acknowledged that he had been in the Newport region. Then he acknowledged that he knew Martha, but he maintained that he had never actually met her. After each unpleasant admission, more lies were told to hide the earlier ones. Although the procedure was draining, Callahan persevered, aware of every avoidance strategy. As the interrogation went on, Asheville was enveloped in darkness. Sheriff Callahan was not in a hurry. At this moment, he realized that patience was his ally. James Thornton was growing more anxious, hungry, and exhausted. He was starting to feel the effects of the constant onslaught of questions and the weight of guilt. He attempted to light a cigarette that the sheriff had provided him, but his hands shook. Callahan adjusted his strategy. He started talking instead of blaming her outright, regarding Martha personally. He talked of her humble home where she lived alone, her honest job as a seamstress, and her quiet life in Newport. He discussed how she was well liked in the neighborhood, how she regularly went to church, and how she had never caused harm to anyone. As James spoke, the sheriff kept a tight eye on his face, searching for any indications of regret or unease. James's demeanor shifted when Callahan brought up the church. The flash was brief and barely noticeable, but the sheriff caught it. He got right to the point. Wasn't Martha attending church that evening? Thursday was the day. You stopped her before she could reach her religious gathering. James's jaw was tight as he gazed at the ground. He said nothing for a few minutes. The ticking of a clock on the wall was the only sound in the space. At last, James started talking. He spoke in a low, nearly whispery voice. Although he acknowledged setting up the meeting with Martha, he maintained that his goal was only to negotiate. He claimed that while looking through county records for the property dispute, his brother Elias had recalled discovering ancient documents, which is how he had learnt about the mineral rights. James recognized a chance. He believed that by persuading Martha to sell the rights, he would receive a substantial commission. The sheriff listened carefully, recording every word. He inquired as to how James had first gotten in touch with Martha and how he had acquired her address. James clarified that he had submitted the initial. Early in March, he sent a letter claiming to have crucial information regarding his parents' estate. Martha had answered warily, but with interest. Throughout their subsequent correspondence, James consistently maintained an enigmatic yet hopeful tone. implying that he had something important to impart. Martha was first apprehensive when James suggested that they meet in person, but he persuaded her that they needed to speak in person since the material was too delicate to be left on paper. He deliberately selected A. He calculated that she could easily stray from the trail for a short while without raising suspicions because he knew she typically attended church. Martha nodded, probably assuming she could get everything straightened up. The conference proceeded according to schedule. Near the intersection of the road leading to the abandoned warehouse, James was waiting for her. He welcomed Martha courteously when she came and suggested that they stroll to a more private location to have a conversation. Carrying the $50 she thought would buy any knowledge he had, she followed him. However, the conversation immediately worsened when they arrived at the warehouse and James disclosed his true desires. In exchange for her quiet and assistance with mining corporations, James had informed Martha that he was aware of the mineral rights contract, that it was extremely valuable, and that she should divide the proceeds with him. Martha was perplexed. She was unaware of any contracts, didn't comprehend the topic of his discussion. She believed it was some sort of hoax and that James was attempting to deceive her. She declined to assist, stating she would go and report the extortion attempt to the sheriff. James claims that everything collapsed at that very time. He went into a panic. His life of deception would be revealed, and he would probably wind himself back behind bars if Martha reported him to the authorities. He grabbed her arm in an attempt to stop her from going. Martha shouted, attempting to escape. James grabbed her mouth to stifle her screams during their brief struggle. At that point, Ruth Pendleton, the mountain widow, had heard the noise that night that scared her. His story was cut short by the sheriff. "You killed her after that." James's eyes widened and he gave a forceful shake of his head. "That wasn't the case. I didn't intend to. All I wanted to do was keep her motionless so she wouldn't scream." However, she continued to struggle, and his voice faded. His shoulders trembled as he hid his face in his fists. Callahan waited. He was aware that James was tense because the complete confession was about to be revealed. A few minutes later, James went on, his. The voice was garbled and nearly unintelligible. He acknowledged that during the conflict, Martha had passed away in the warehouse. He claims it was a horrible accident and that he had no intention of killing her. He became absolutely terrified when he saw that she was no longer breathing. Hours passed while he tried to make up his mind. The body couldn't be left there. They'd find out soon enough. Before he could flee, he had to conceal her. After carrying Martha to his wagon, he concealed it behind the shed and bided his time until past midnight. Then, knowing the routes from his prior weeks of studying the area, he drove through the pitch-black mountain trails. It was almost by mistake that he discovered that lonely clearing, a location so remote that he thought no one would ever locate it. He left Martha there, covering her with branches in an unsuccessful attempt at hiding. He grabbed her pocketbook with the intention of throwing it far away, but instead he just threw it into the woods while running. His only prize was the $50 Martha had brought for this terrible catastrophe. However, James's fixation on mining rights persisted. He returned covertly to the abandoned Whitlock farm in the days that followed as the hunt for Martha got underway. He dug and looked for the hidden metal box for hours before finding it. The contract he had long desired was inside. With the paperwork in hand, he left the area and headed south across the mountains. He spent months trying to find a way to make money off the deal without raising any red flags. Finally, he made. It was brought to Asheville, where he attempted to sell it to a land speculator by making up a complex tale about how he had obtained the document. However, the buyer was wary, inquired excessively, and ultimately called the police. Before James could finish the sale, he was taken into custody. Sheriff Callahan reclined on his seat, taking in all that he had been told. In many respects, James's confession confirmed his suspicions. 2 lives were ruined in a tragedy caused by a crime motivated by greed and exacerbated by panic. James's through the fallout from his deeds, and Martha's directly. It was just the basic nastiness of human avarice, nothing poetic or enigmatic. But there were still questions. James was asked about his brother, Elias, by the sheriff. Was he aware of the scheme? Was he somehow involved? James rejected it emphatically. He said that Elias was unaware of what he had done. During a visit months prior, his older brother had just mentioned old records in passing, never realizing that James would commit such heinous atrocities using that information. James maintained that he didn't want to bring his brother down with him, so he took action alone. That part Callahan believed. Because he didn't trust couples, he knew folks like James who were lone con artists. It's likely that Elias Thornton was an honest man, attempting to earn a living in the Virginia mines. The sheriff requested that Asheville authorities properly transcribe James's confession, because he was unaware that his brother had obliquely utilized his remarks as motivation for murder. He required, everything must be properly observed, signed, and documented in order for it to be admitted in court. James complied completely, exhausted and apparently relieved to finally confess. With a trembling hand, he signed the papers acknowledging his involvement in Martha Whitlock's murder. The days that followed were a flurry of legal and regulatory action. Sheriff Callahan was responsible for organizing James Thornton's return to Tennessee, making sure that all of the evidence was appropriately categorized, and getting the case ready for trial. He also got the mineral back. Wright's contract James had attempted to sell, retaining it as important proof. The hidden motivation behind it all was symbolized by that yellowed sheet of paper with its deep wrinkles and faded ink. The capture was swiftly reported. Dramatic headlines in a special edition of the Newport Plain Talk announced the capture of Martha Whitlock's killer. The streets of the city were crowded with people discussing the most recent events. Others were merely relieved to know, while others expressed happiness that justice had been done, that none of the criminals were still out there. A small gathering gathered at the train station in early August when James was returned to Newport. In such a small community, confidentiality was impossible, despite the sheriff's insistence on discretion. With 2 cops escorting him, James exited the train in handcuffs, his head lowered to avoid their accusing stares. Callahan swiftly escorted the prisoner to a closed wagon that would transport him straight to the county jail after someone in the crowd said something offensive. The cell in which James would wait. The trial had a single high window that was guarded with iron, and it was small and Spartan with solid stone walls. There, alone with his thoughts and the mounting consequences of his deeds, he would spend the next few months. The sheriff placed guards on duty around the clock, not so much to prevent escape, but to make sure that no irate citizen would try to impose punishment on himself. Callahan sought to close the investigation's remaining holes in the interim. He returned to Parrotsville to tell Sarah Thornton of the arrest of her brother-in-law. The woman's hands were shaking as she clutched a cup of tea that was getting cold without being consumed, clearly upset by the news. She said that she had always viewed James as a little inconvenience, a weak but not dangerous man, and that she had never imagined him capable of something so terrible. Sarah had updates on Elias as well. The previous week her husband had returned from Virginia, exhausted but relieved to be at home. Upon discovering his brother's behavior, Elias was heartbroken. After a lengthy conversation, the sheriff assured him that he was not involved in James' crimes. Elias clarified that he had never anticipated the terrible repercussions of his remarks, which had been made in passing during family discussions about the ancient Whitlock estate papers. In order to give prosecutors and defense lawyers time to prepare their cases, The trial was set for October. A young guy called Robert Mitchell was the lawyer appointed to represent James. I recently graduated, yet I'm still idealistic, devoted to the idea that everyone should have access to quality legal counsel. Mitchell labored hard to find any mitigating circumstances that would affect the outcome, even though he knew his case was almost hopeless. The defense's main tactic was to show that Martha's death was accidental and the outcome of an encounter that had sadly gone out of control. Mitchell would contend that James did not intend to kill, and that his actions were motivated by fear and panic rather than intentional malice. It was a fine line, attempting to lower the allegation from intentional homicide to a less serious offense. Mitchell, however, was aware that it was his only opportunity. The prosecution developed a completely different case under the direction of seasoned prosecutor Theodore Warren. Warren portrayed James as a cunning criminal who had meticulously planned every move, including the deceptive letters, the secret meeting that was purposefully scheduled for when Martha would be alone herself, and the selection of a remote site. Warren would contend that even in cases where the murder was not technically planned, James had intentionally produced the circumstances that allowed for the violence. Autumn's first symptoms appeared in September. The lowlands were painted with shades of scarlet and gold as the trees on the mountains started to change color. The pace of life in Newport persisted, but it was always shadowed by the approaching trial. Many members of the community intended to go to court in order to witness the administration of justice. Sheriff Callahan also attempted to settle Martha's estate during this period, without any knowledge. In theory, the land and mineral rights would return to the county's direct heirs. However, the sheriff found out that Martha had been corresponding with a distant cousin in Chattanooga. He got in touch with her, outlining the circumstances and telling her about the mining rights, which were worth a little fortune. In late September, Helen Cartwright, the cousin, made a trip to Newport. When the sheriff showed her the house where she lived, the woman, who was in her 40s, had a gentle face and eyes that filled with sorrow. Martha was still alive. Helen claimed that although she had always liked her cousin, the two were not close and just infrequently exchanged letters. The fact that Martha had passed away without understanding the full worth of the estate she had inherited from her parents astounded her. In order for Helen to legitimately claim the bequest, the sheriff gave her the records attesting to her link to Martha. Helen gave him a heartfelt thank you, but her tone was dejected. This unanticipated good fortune was tarnished by tragedy and blood, a bitter. She took the gift more out of obligation to her family than out of happiness. The days before the trial were stressful. The two-story county courthouse in downtown Newport was ready to receive what would probably be the most important case in the recent history of the area. Documents were carefully arranged, windows were cleaned, and benches were polished. Hamilton Pierce, the presiding judge, was a gay-haired man with 3 decades of experience, who was renowned for his fairness and seriousness. The courthouse opened to the public early on October 3rd. People from Newport and surrounding towns crowded into the galleries fighting for seats. In an attempt to get a seat, other people arrived hours early. Something deeper, a sort of collective thirst to see justice done, was coupled with a heavy sense of expectancy. Handcuffed, James Thornton was taken from the jail. He tried to appear as respectable as possible to the jury by dressing in clean clothing that Attorney Mitchell had supplied, but the change that months of incarceration had caused in him could not be concealed by any amount of clothing. James was leaner, his eyes sunken with a distant, tortured appearance, and his complexion pallid as though he had been out of the sun too long. 2 whole days were spent on the jury selecting procedure. Every candidate was asked a lot of questions concerning their beliefs, biases, and past understanding of the case. Knowing that these 12 individuals would decide James's fate, Warren and Mitchell disagreed with each choice. Finally, A. The jury was seated. Farmers, business people, and an educator. As was customary at the time, all men pledged to base their decisions only on the evidence that was put forth. The trial began in a somber manner. Judge Pierce gave an explanation of the proceedings, the rights of the defendant, and the duties of the jury. His well-crafted words reverberated off the courtroom's wooden walls. Theodore Warren then got up to make his introductory remarks. He moved slowly in front of the jury, looking at each face before starting to talk. Martha Whitlock was a victim of brutal manipulation, according to Warren. He talked about the dishonest letters and how James won her trust only to take advantage of her. In a controlled but emotionally charged voice, Warren recounted the extortion attempt, the deadly encounter, and James' claims regarding mineral rights. He also talked about how Martha died alone and terrified at the hands of a man she had only ever known via written lies. After Theodore Warren completed his, the courtroom was quiet throughout the opening remarks. With deliberate strides, he made his way back to the prosecution's table, allowing his remarks to linger in the jurors' thoughts. Robert Mitchell was then given the opportunity to make his defense. The young lawyer got up, walked to stand in front of the jury, and anxiously adjusted his waistcoat. Despite his obvious youth, his posture conveyed determination. Mitchell made no effort to refute the obvious facts. Given James's thorough confession, it would have been useless. Rather, he concentrated on giving his client a human face and demonstrating that this was the tale of a frail guy who made grave errors rather than a monster. He talked about James's challenging existence, his poverty, the bad decisions that resulted in the small crime, and ultimately that terrible night when everything went terribly wrong. Even though Martha's death was tragic, Mitchell pleaded with the jurors to remember that it was the product of an uncontrollable panic rather than pure malice. Testimony poured forth in the days that followed. Sheriff Callahan was the first to testify, meticulously detailing every stage of the inquiry. He talked about the clearing where the body was discovered, the pieces of fabric, and the finding of Martha's pocketbook. He displayed the map he had made, which connected each pertinent site and depicted the crime's geography. Warren led him through thoughtfully constructed questions, creating a timeline that the jury could follow with ease. Elenina Hayes provided testimony regarding her most recent encounter with Martha was still alive, recounting that typical March afternoon when they spoke inanely about the weather. She remembered how Martha appeared only mildly exhausted, showing no signs of the horror that would await her hours later, and her voice faltered. Before she connected it to Martha's abduction, Ruth Pendleton talked about the muffled scream she had heard in the woods and how it had plagued her for weeks. In his presentation of his medical findings, Dr. Harrison Mills described in technical but intelligible language the evidence of Martha's neck marks, asphyxiation, and the lack of any other serious injuries. In an effort to bolster his account of an impulsive, unplanned conduct, Mitchell tried to take advantage of the doctor's testimony by highlighting the lack of evidence of lengthy or sadistic assault. Warren swiftly countered, however, reminding the jury that Martha had experienced horror in her last moments, regardless of how abrupt her death had been. In her testimony, Margaret Foster from the boarding home in Sevilleville, describing James's visit and showing the logbook in which he signed his name as James Thornton. The hunter who discovered Martha's bag, William Dutch, recounted the moment he spotted anything out of the ordinary among the leaves while out on the path. Douglas Freeman discussed his discussion with Martha in Knoxville on her worries regarding the property dispute. When James's written confession was read aloud to the court, it was the most emotional moment. Warren was careful to show every page and every phrase James had signed in Asheville. The confession was unavoidable, comprehensive, and incriminating. James sat still in his chair, gazing at his hands clenched in his lap while the words were read. A few jurors scowled, while others gave a subtle shake of their heads. Mitchell gave cross-examinations his best effort. He wondered if James was sane when he signed the confession, if he really understood the legal ramifications of his remarks, and if the confession had been obtained under duress. Sheriff Callahan, however, was adamant in his responses. Yes, after hours of interrogation, James had readily confessed, but he had not made any improper promises or threats. He was relieved to finally speak the truth and was alert and coherent. The defense made an effort to present Martha in a way that implied some shared accountability for the gathering. Mitchell implied that she had brought money and willingly consented to meet a stranger in a remote area, implying that she intended to engage in dubious commercial transactions. However, this line of reasoning flopped horribly. Warren took advantage of the jurors' obvious stiffening to stress that it was disgusting and morally repugnant to imply that Martha was responsible for her own death. The much-anticipated moment finally came on the 6th day of the trial. It would be James Thornton who would testify in his own defense. Despite Mitchell's warnings about the dangers, James persisted. He wanted to talk, wanted people to hear his version of events straight from the source. Maybe he had some residual conceit, or maybe he had sincere regret that needed to be publicly acknowledged. In a trembling voice, James vowed to speak the truth. His hands gripped the wooden arms of the witness chair till his knuckles turned white. Mitchell walked him through a series of fundamental questions to learn about his life, struggles, and poor decisions. James talked about his poverty, how he had always looked for quick methods to become wealthy, and how the news of the mining rights felt like a miracle. He acknowledged planning to extort money or property rights, persuading Martha into attending the meeting and sending the letters to her. But when it came to the final moments, his voice broke. James said he had no intention of harming Martha, tears running down his cheeks. He said that he didn't recognize his own strength until it was too late, that he just meant to momentarily silence her, and that he panicked when she threatened to expose him. "I'm not a murderer," James said repeatedly. "I'm a liar and a thief, but I'm not a murderer," he said in an emotional voice. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed dramatically when Theodore Warren stood up for cross-examination. "It was a terrible accident, and not a day goes by that I don't wish I could go back in time and change everything." Mitchell concluded his interrogation there in the hopes that this show of regret would affect at least some jurors. Warren approached James slowly and stood in front of him, his eyes focused on the defendant. Warren's questions, which were surgical in nature and intended to dismantle every element of James' story of an impulsive crime, included inquiries about the weeks of preparation, the meticulously written letters intended to influence Martha, the reasons behind James's choice of that specific time and location, the decision to conceal the body, the removal of the purse, and the theft of the money. Each question added to the mounting evidence of premeditation and cold calculation, and Warren then asked the devastating query, "Mr. Thornton, how long did it take you to return to search for the mineral rights contract after Martha Whitlock passed away?" Warren pressed, "And when you found that contract, what did you feel?" James paused, his eyes moving away. "A few days," he muttered. "Feelings of regret for the woman you killed, or contentment at achieving what you've always desired at last?" Warren allowed the question to linger in the air for a few moments because James was unable to respond, and his silence was more powerful than words. Mitchell attempted to mend the damage during redirect questions, but it was too late. The facade of sincere regret James had attempted to preserve had fallen away, exposing the cunning opportunist underneath. Closing arguments took place on the 8th day of the trial, and Warren spoke for almost 2 hours, methodically recounting all the evidence, connecting each piece and demonstrating the obvious pattern of premeditation and greed. He ended by pleading with the jury to bring justice to Martha Whitlock, an innocent woman whose only transgression was believing the written words of a man who saw in her only a chance for financial gain. Mitchell did his best in his closing argument, appealing to empathy and an awareness of the complexity of human nature, arguing that putting James to death would not bring Martha back, and that it was crucial for the integrity of the case to distinguish between premeditated murder and panic-induced homicide. Judge Pierce gave the jury final instructions on the morning of the 9th day. His voice was deep and solemn as he explained the various degrees of murder they could consider, the legal definitions of premeditation, and the mitigating circumstances that could influence the sentence. The 12 men listened intently, aware of the enormous weight of their decisions, and then they retired to the deliberation. However, his words sounded hollow in comparison to the compelling story Warren had crafted. Room, a tiny room in the back of the courthouse, where they would spend the next few hours discussing James Thornton's fate. The galleries were still full. Nobody wanted to miss the verdict. Some carried baskets of food, ready to stay all day if needed. Quiet conversations filled the room. Opinions on guilt and suitable punishment were divided. Sheriff Callahan sat calmly in a side chair. A court official knocked on the door of the judge's chambers, and Pierce returned to the courtroom in his flowing black robe. 4 hours later, the jury signaled that they were ready. The courtroom was called to order, and silence descended like a thick blanket. James was brought back, his expression blank and his eyes distant, as if he had already become emotionally detached from the verdict. Mitchell gave him a brief gesture of silent support by holding his shoulder. The jury foreman, A. When Judge Pierce asked if they had reached a verdict, middle-aged farmer Samuel Morris stood with a piece of paper in his hand, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," Morris said firmly, and the courtroom held its breath. In the case of the state of Tennessee versus James Thornton for the crime of intentional homicide, we the jury find the defendant guilty, Morris said. Through the galleries came a murmur. A few gave approving nods, others merely exhaled with relief that the issue was at last. Warren gave himself a small nod of satisfaction, knowing that justice, at least in its legal form, had prevailed. The sentence would be decided in a separate hearing scheduled for the following week, giving the defense time to prepare mitigating arguments, though everyone knew the options were limited. James didn't react visibly, remaining motionless as if turned to stone. Mitchell closed his eyes briefly, accepting the defeat he knew was inevitable. Mitchell would argue that even a criminal deserved the chance at eventual redemption, and that homicide could result in either life in prison or the death penalty. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold October morning, with the courthouse's exterior trees now completely golden, their leaves falling in slow spirals whenever the wind blew. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was even more solemn than it had been during the trial, with no arguments about guilt or innocence, only the icy question of. Then Mitchell read aloud letters from members of James's family, including one from Sarah Thornton and another from Elias himself, begging for clemency. Both letters acknowledged the seriousness of the crimes, but asked that James's life be spared. Elias had written that he had forgiven his brother, that despite everything, he still believed there was some spark of humanity in him worth preserving. Warren's last witness was Helen Cartwright, Martha's cousin, who ascended the days wearing black and her eyes red from recent tears. In a composed yet emotional voice, Helen described Martha as a good, hard-working woman who never hurt anyone and who deserved to live much longer than the 28 years she had left. She claimed that Martha had plain dreams, hoping to one day get married, start a family, and age peacefully, all of which were taken from her by a man motivated by the most heinous greed. Helen looked directly at James for the first time and said, "But I do ask for justice. Martha can't speak for herself, so I speak for her. Her life had value. Her death shouldn't be minimized or forgotten. Whatever the sentence, it won't bring my cousin back. But it will establish that taking an innocent life has consequences." Judge Pierce listened intently, taking occasional notes, and asked James if he had anything to say after the testimony was over. Before being sentenced, James stood slowly, the chains jingling around his ankles, and looked at Helen, the judge, and the jury that had found him guilty. "That can undo what I did. I took a life I had no right to take. I've lived my entire existence looking for shortcuts, avoiding responsibility, always thinking only of myself. Martha Whitlock paid the ultimate price for my greed and cowardice." He paused, swallowing hard. "I deserve whatever punishment this court meted out." "Thank you, James." Then, using the power granted to him by the state of Tennessee, Judge Pierce pronounced the sentence. James Thornton would be sentenced to life in prison at the Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville, where he would spend the remainder of his days without the possibility of parole. I hope that my story serves as a warning to others who might be walking similar paths. Greed consumes all, and in the end, you're left with nothing but regret and chains. Judge Pierce banged his gavel one last time, declaring the session closed. Warren methodically arranged his documents, satisfied that the case had reached its proper conclusion. Mitchell briefly placed his hand on his shoulder, a final act of humanity before the officers led the condemned man back to his cell. There was no dramatic reaction. James simply nodded, as if he had expected exactly that. Over the course of the following few weeks, life in Newport gradually returned to normal. The small house where Martha Whitlock had lived stood empty for months before Helen decided to sell it. The mineral rights money was used by Helen Cartwright to establish a small fund in Martha's memory to help single Newport women who needed assistance establishing a new life. Autumn faded into winter. Snow covered the Appalachian Mountains with its silent white blanket, and Martha Whitlock's case became history, something people mentioned occasionally but no longer dominated daily conversations. The fund would go on to help countless women achieve the independence that Martha never had the opportunity to fully enjoy. Sheriff Callahan kept the case file neatly organized in his office, and sometimes, on quiet nights, he would revisit it, rereading testimony and examining evidence because something about the case haunted him, not because it was a professional necessity. It was a small but meaningful way to ensure that something positive emerged from this dark tragedy. James Thornton was transferred to Nashville on a freezing November morning. The train ride took several hours, crossing the mountains he had explored with such sinister intentions, and when he arrived at the penitentiary, a stone complex that looked more like a medieval fortress than a modern prison, James finally understood the full extent of the crime. Perhaps it was the cruel randomness of how Martha had been chosen as a victim, or perhaps the memory of how her body lay in that clearing, so alone in the mountains she had known her entire life. The years that followed James Thornton's trial were characterized by a heavy silence in Newport. The community healed slowly, like a deep wound that leaves a permanent mark even after it heals. People continued to work in the fields, attend church, and raise their children. However, Martha Whitlock's case remained etched in the collective memory as a grim reminder that evil can reach even the most serene locations. The Nashville Penitentiary became James Thornton's whole universe. His first weeks there were a harsh adjustment to the reality of life in prison. The cell he shared with another prisoner was about 10 feet by 14 feet, with 2 narrow beds, a small sink, and a window too high to allow any view of the outside world. The quiet of the mountains he had known was replaced by the incessant sound of metal doors slamming, voices resounding through the stone corridors, and the never-ending footsteps of guards making rounds. James was put to work in the prison's carpentry shop, where inmates made basic furniture that was sold to state institutions. It was mind-numbing, repetitive work, the kind of routine that characterized life in prison. He woke up at dawn, worked 8 hours, ate bland meals in noisy cafeterias, and spent his nights in his cell thinking about the decisions that had led him there. Over the months, James established a writing routine, recording his. He wrote about Martha often, trying to understand why he had done what he had, how a single moment of panic had completely destroyed 2 lives, and his thoughts and memories in cheap notebooks he bought with the little money he earned from his job. In 1923, 2 years after his conviction, James received an unexpected letter from Helen Cartwright, whose cousin had written that she had struggled with herself for months, debating whether or not to get in touch, but ultimately came to the conclusion that she needed to share some information. Her letter didn't offer forgiveness, that was evident from the start, but it did discuss how important it was for James to fully comprehend Martha as a person, not just as a victim. Helen talked about Martha's early years, how she had to quickly learn independence after losing her parents at a young age, and her aspirations to grow her sewing business and possibly open a bigger store. Helen wanted James to understand that he had killed not just a name on legal documents, but a whole woman with hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows. In Knoxville, she mentioned Martha's love of poetry and how she used to copy verses into notebooks she kept with care. The letter devastated James in a way that the court ruling had not. Reading about Martha's humanity, the little details of her existence, made her crime horribly real in a new way. Weeks later, he wrote back to Helen, a brief letter expressing gratitude for taking the time to write and swearing he would never forget what she said. Helen never answered, and James didn't think she would. That conversation had been useful. Years passed into decades inside those stone walls. James grew older than most long-term inmates do. His hair had gone completely white before he turned 50. His face was etched with deep wrinkles, and he had a chronic cough that settled in his lungs from the damp, poorly ventilated prison air. He kept up his carpentry work for as long as his health allowed, finding comfort in. Elias Thornton only made one in-person visit to his brother in 1927. It was a painful and uncomfortable encounter. 2 men separated by iron bars and the unbridgeable chasm of James's crime. Elias stated that he had come primarily to say goodbye in person because he intended to move with Sarah to Oregon, where job opportunities seemed more promising, and that he had forgiven James because he carried hatred for. The remainder of his life would be too much poison. With tears in his eyes, James thanked his brother, and they briefly discussed childhood memories, the parents they had both lost so long ago, and how lives can take such different paths. When Elias departed, James realized he would most likely never see his brother again. It was like severing the last link between him and the outside world. Sheriff Callahan retired in 1930 after nearly 25 years of service to Cockey County. During his final trip to the Nitkin, Callahan stood there for almost an hour, listening to the wind whisper through the leaves and watching shadows move across the forest floor, thinking of all the lives this case had touched, all the questions answered, and those that never were. The clearing where Martha had been found was now completely reclaimed by vegetation, with young trees growing where the ground had once been bare, and no trace of the terrible events that had occurred there. Would be. He thought about Martha, a woman he had never met in person but felt he knew well after months of research. He said a silent prayer before departing, not being a very religious man, but feeling that this place needed some recognition. Records show that James Thornton passed away at the Tennessee State Penitentiary in March 1941 at the age of 59. Although pneumonia was listed as the official cause, His body and soul were exhausted by the accumulation of 20 years of confinement. He was buried in. Martha Whitlock's story gradually became local legend, told in increasingly distorted versions by people who didn't live through the actual events. Some details were exaggerated, others forgotten, until only the essence remained. The prison cemetery was a simple area reserved for prisoners without family to claim their remains. His headstone bore only a name and date, no elaborate epitaph. Newport continued to exist as it always had, a small mountain community where seasons pass and generations succeed. Died for someone else's greed and justice finally won out. The Whitlock estate changed hands multiple times over the years, and the mineral rights were never fully utilized because of market changes or technical issues. That yellowed contract that had cost Martha her life turned out to be worth less than James had anticipated. Maybe this was poetic irony, or maybe it just proved that greed is frequently founded on illusions more than reality. Today, if you visit Newport, there is a small historical museum downtown that houses archives of important events in the area, including a section dedicated to the 1921 event, where you can see faded photographs of the courthouse where James was tried, copies of articles from the Newport Plain Talk, and even one of the city's original character. The Appalachian Mountains still encircle the valley, still covered in dense forests where trails disappear into the trees. One of the few surviving photographs of a young woman with a serious expression, as was typical of photographs taken at the time, is found on the maps Sheriff Callahan used for the investigation. Her eyes stare straight into the camera, not realizing that this is all that future generations would ever know of her face. Martha Whitlock's story serves as a reminder of some unsettling realities about human nature, such as how greed can turn people into monsters and how trust can be used as a weapon. The mountains that witnessed the terrible events of March 1921 remain unchanged, eternal in their indifference to the human dramas unfolding in their shadows. They were there long before Martha was born, remained there as her brief life unfolded, and remained there decades after her death. However, it also serves as a reminder of the resiliency of communities, the importance of justice, even when it cannot undo the harm, and how memory preserves the dignity of those we have lost. This continuity, which reminds us of how small we are in the face of time and geography, is both reassuring and terrifying. If you liked this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in Appalachian history, you might want to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on Martha Whitlock's case and enable notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos where we'll keep exploring the dark mysteries that time has attempted to bury.